Okay, today we are going to talk about combining aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So let's start with combining AD and SRAS. Now let's start with our graph, and we're going to be drawing, let's see, price level, and we've got real GDP down here, and we've got our aggregate demand curve that's always downward sloping, and our SRAS that's always upward sloping. Now the intersection of these two curves is what gives us the price level for the economy. We'll label that P, and the output for the economy, we'll label that Y. So I do think it's important for you to understand when we're using this graph that GDP and the term output are synonymous, and price level and the term inflation are also synonymous. And so you will see those questions worded both ways when we use the aggregate supply and the aggregate demand graph. Okay, and the intersection between the SRAS and the AD is what we call the short run equilibrium. And it's important to know that the short run equilibrium is where the SRAS is equal to the AD. That's where the two curves intersect. And also, that's where we use the short run equilibrium to determine our actual GDP and our actual price level. So whenever you're asked what the actual GDP or price level is for an economy, you will always find that short run equilibrium. And that's the point where our SRAS and our aggregate demand intersect. Okay, now we're going to talk about two different examples using the aggregate supply and the aggregate demand graph. So let's use example 1. And we're going to call this a demand shock. Now, demand shock really is just fancy for any scenario that could change our aggregate demand. So example number 1 for demand shock, let's say that interest rates increase in the U.S. Interest rates increase in the U.S. and we want to know how this scenario is going to influence our economy. And we're going to use our aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph to illustrate that change or that impact. So I'm going to draw a graph just like we did on the previous page. And I'm going to label this price level and real GDP. And I'm going to draw my aggregate demand and my SRAS. And I'm going to label my current equilibrium. Always label your equilibrium. Now, we need to know that or how the change in interest rate is going to influence our economy. So the first thing I need to think about is, are interest rates a determinant of aggregate demand or of aggregate supply? So I got to go back to my notes, or eventually I got to have these memorized. And in my notes, I should find that a change in interest rate is a determinant of aggregate demand. Okay? So I'm going to put here that this equals a decrease in AD. Now, in parentheses, I'm going to put an increase in interest rate equals a decrease in consumer and investment spending. And that's just the components of aggregate demand that are going to change because of this interest rate change. So every time interest rates change, businesses and individuals in that economy are going to either borrow and spend more or borrow and spend less, depending on what that change is. So now that I've identified the change in my graph, because aggregate demand is going to change, I'm going to graph that change. So I'm going to use arrows to show that my curve is going to shift to the left. I'm going to draw a new AD curve, label that AD1. I'm going to find my new equilibrium. And now my economy has a new short-run equilibrium at P1Y1. Now, ultimately, I want to know, when interest rates change in the economy, how is that going to influence the price level and the output in my economy? So I'm drawing arrows here to show that both price level and output are going to fall. So we're going to put over here a decrease in AD equals a decrease in price level, a decrease in real GDP, and I also need to identify how this is going to change the unemployment rate. So I have to remember that there's always a connection between GDP and unemployment. When our GDP is falling, then that means that we are going to be producing less, so we're going to be using less workers, which in turn is going to cause the unemployment rate to go up. And quick tip, the change in GDP and the change in unemployment will always be opposite from each other. So there you have it. You have a demand shock. We would call this a negative demand shock because the AD is shifting left as a result of the interest rate change, which then will lead to a decrease in inflation, a decrease in output, and an increase in unemployment in this economy. Now we're going to make one more example. Last example is going to be a supply shock. Put supply shock. And this is just going to be a scenario where our supply curve is going to change. And we'll say in this example that there is an increase in nominal wages. An increase in nominal wages. Now, we need to remember that wages are always going to be considered a resource cost, and resource costs always change the aggregate supply curve. So that's why this is going to lead to a supply shock. So I'm going to draw my graph. Got price level. Got real GDP. Aggregate demand. And my aggregate supply curve. I'm going to make sure I label my initial equilibrium, Y and P, for output and price level. And now I'm going to go back to my scenario, and I have to try to figure out, how did the change in wages impact my graph? Well, whenever wages go up, that's taking money away from businesses so they can produce less. And so I'm going to decrease the SRAS. I'm going to draw it on the graph. Remember, left is always less. Draw a new SRAS. Label that SRAS1. I find my new equilibrium. And I'm going to label that Y1 and P1. So I can figure out now that my end result is that the decrease in SRAS is going to cause an increase in price level, a decrease in real GDP, And if GDP is falling, then that tells me that my unemployment, is going to increase. So now I know how a change in nominal wages impacts an economy.